So before I begin, I want to just do a very quick introductory session on what exactly we mean by social finance. One of the things that I discovered when I moved into this area about 10 years ago was that social finance is one of the most jargon-filled areas of finance. And so I want to try and demystify that process. And one of the reasons why it's so challenging is because everybody uses terms slightly differently, right? So people define social enterprise, social venture, social business, social investment, all in their own way. And so there's a lot of confusion around this. So I want to just quickly share with you how I'm going to define them. And then that will give us the basis for deciding whether you should be raising social finance or not. So let's just begin with a basic definition. I'm going to draw a distinction between a social venture or a social enterprise and a social business. And here's how I'm going to make that distinction. I'm going to define a social venture as any organization which has a social mission at its core. So this includes charities, for example. They clearly have a social mission, but it also includes businesses that are raising money in order to support a particular cause, for example. And then I'm going to restrict the term social business to specifically an organization which has a commercial business model. In other words, it sells products or services to paying customers in order to achieve a specific social mission. So on that basis, social venture is actually a broad range of different options, and social business is a subset of those organizations that actually have commercial business models. In other words, they sell goods and services in order to achieve the social mission. And one of the consequences of this is that a social business must seek to be profitable, right? So essentially, a social business funds itself through the profit that it makes. But it doesn't mean that it necessarily has to be profit maximizing, unlike a normal conventional for-profit venture. So social businesses are profit-generating businesses. They seek to be profitable, but they use those profits in order to serve a social mission. And they don't necessarily aim to maximize profit as their primary goal. So that's a distinction between a social business and a conventional or normal business. I'm also going to draw a distinction between a for-profit and non-profit. And again, you often hear these terms used interchangeably: for-profit, business, company, non-profit, NGO, charity, right? But I'm going to be a little bit more precise. What I'm going to do is I'm going to define each of these as legal entities. So a for-profit is a legal entity which can engage in commercial activity, and it makes profits which it can distribute to its shareholders. In other words, it's a company which has shares and shareholders, right? And that's a very, very important distinction between a for-profit and a non-profit. And then a non-profit is a regulated legal entity that has a clear social mission. And in many countries, NGOs are not allowed to operate commercially. In other words, you cannot sell goods and services, although in some countries you can. And moreover, many nonprofits are tax exempt. I mean, that's typically why you would be a nonprofit, is because you don't have to pay corporation tax, but the quid pro quo is that you are regulated. You must have a clear social mission, and there are often very severe constraints on what you can do commercially. So we draw a legal distinction between for-profit and non-profit.
Mark?
Yes, please.
Is it possible to ask a question?
Sure.
This is Eric Felt here from Nordea. Do you also acknowledge a third category called not for profit, or is that the same as non-profit?
So I would define not for profit as the same as a non-profit in this case for the purposes of simplicity. However, I think what you're pointing to is that in some jurisdictions, there are kind of intermediate legal forms that sit between the two. So for example, in the United States, we have a form called the L3C, which is kind of a hybrid between for-profit and non-profit. In the UK, we have a form called the CIC, or the Community Interest Company, which again has some characteristics of both. Essentially, they are companies that can issue shares, but they have a social mission. And sometimes they have tax breaks and sometimes they don't, right? So that's a technical refinement, and we can certainly speak to that a little bit later. But just for now, I just want to draw a distinction between for-profit and non-profit as the two fundamental distinctions between the two. And the reason why this is important is because that there are certain types of financing which are only possible for for-profits. So these would typically be equity, in other words, the ability to raise shares in your company. is something which typically only a for-profit can do. And there are other forms of financing which typically are only available for non-profits, in other words, grants or philanthropy. And so, the choice of what finance you raise is going to be partially driven by what kind of legal entity you have. And the choice of what legal entity you have is going to be driven fundamentally by what kind of business model you have. In other words, if you're predominantly a commercial business model, maybe you're going to be a for-profit. If you're predominantly an impact model, which raises donations in order to serve beneficiaries, which is what most of our social entrepreneurs begin as, then you might very well start off as a non-profit. The problem is that whichever legal entity you choose locks you in to your options later on. So if you begin as a non-profit and then you decide that later on you actually want to be a for-profit and raise equity, you might have a real challenge on your hands. And although many of our fellows do actually make that transition and actually set up for-profit subsidiaries. So, but I just want to just flag right at the beginning that there is this big challenge which many social entrepreneurs face, is that right from day one, you have to choose what kind of path you're going to follow. Are you going to be a business and raise investment, or are you going to be a charity and raise grants? And then if you're a hybrid, if you're between the two and you have business elements and you also have charitable elements, it can be a real dilemma, right? Which one of those two are you going to pick? And so in a moment, I'm going to give you a framework for making that decision. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. But I just want to flag very early on that this is a big challenge that many of our fellows face, is this dilemma, which we call the social entrepreneur's dilemma. Should you be a for-profit or should you be a non-profit? Right from day one, it decides what kind of finance you will raise. Okay. A couple other terms and distinctions that I want to just throw out there very quickly. The distinction between a customer and a beneficiary. Charities have beneficiaries. In other words, they raise funds, and with those funds, they do good things for people who benefit from them, right? And so charities are very used to thinking about beneficiaries. Customers are what for-profits serve. So customers sell goods and services for-profits sell goods and services to customers in exchange for money. And very often social enterprises use these two terms interchangeably because they often imagine they're one and the same thing. But actually they needn't be, right? You might be selling to customers, but using the profits to support beneficiaries. So we just want to draw a distinction between customer and beneficiary when we start talking about social business models. Another distinction I want to draw is between social finance and social investment. And again, these terms are often used interchangeably. However, in my view, they're not the same thing. So let's define social finance as being any kind of funding that you raise in order to support a social mission, right? So that could include grants, it could include philanthropy, it could include investment in the form of debt or equity. And let's restrict the term social investment to funding for a social mission, but where the funder must be repaid at some point in the future. In other words, they want to have at least their money back, if not some degree of positive return on top, right? So investment must be repaid. And that's a critical distinction between investment and funding generally, for example. And one of the consequences of that distinction is as follows. Only social businesses generate profits, since only social businesses actually sell goods and services at a profit, right? So if you're a non-profit, you only cover your costs through donations, but you never actually make a surplus, right? So the consequence of that is that only social businesses can actually raise social investment, right? Because if social investment must be repaid, if I give you a loan and I want that loan to be repaid with interest at some point in the future, then the only way that you can actually repay me is if you actually make profit. And you can only make profit if you're actually a business. So charities don't make profit, therefore charities cannot raise investment. Okay, so that's just, again, an absolutely fundamental a distinction which must be drawn. And I've seen many charities make the mistake of exploring raising investment when they actually have no commercial model that generates profits. If you don't generate profits, you can't repay. If you can't repay, you can't raise investment. Therefore, the only form of investment you can raise is grants or philanthropy. Okay, so that's a very, very important point to establish right at the beginning. If you're thinking about raising investment, you have to ask yourself the question, do you actually have a business model as part of what you do, which actually generates profits? And could that business model actually generate more profit than it actually costs to run the business? If the answer is yes, you can explore investment. If the answer is no, you shouldn't waste your time with investment, right? And for a significant number of our clients and our Ashoka followers, we actually advise them don't raise investment. We've analyzed your what you do, and it clearly makes sense for it to do it as a non-profit. That there is no point in commercializing it because you're not going to generate enough profit in order to make investment make sense. So that's a fundamental piece of analysis that we would work with you to do if you were to be part of our program, or that any financial advisor would work with you to do. And then a final distinction that I want to draw is between revenue and investment. And again, many people use these terms interchangeably. So revenue is actual payment that you receive for the goods, services, or programs that you deliver. Okay, so revenue in this definition is income received for goods and services that you deliver. And investment is funding that you raise to build the capacity of your organization to grow. So investors don't give you revenue, they give you investment. In other words, they write you a check in order that you use the money in order to hire staff, grow your business, build the capacity. And the purpose of the investment is not to buy goods and services from you. So anybody who writes you a check and says, with that check, I'd like you to deliver 1,000 workshops, that is revenue from a customer, right? But anybody who gives you a check and says, I'm going to give you $1,000, and with the $1,000, I want you to buy a car so that you can deliver more goods and services to those people in Tanzania, that's an investor. That's somebody who's giving you money in order to build your capacity to grow. And so we want to draw a distinction between people who are customers who give you revenue and people who are investors who give you money to build your capacity to grow, right? Social investment, you're looking for investors. In order to find investors, you have to have a business. In order to have a business, you must have customers and people who are willing to buy something from you. So that's the chain and the sequence that you need to have in order to be able to raise investment. You've got to have a business model that sells goods and services at a profit. You've got to have a customer who's willing to pay you for those goods and services. And then once you've got a customer, you're able to go to an investor and say, can I please have investment? Because I can now service these customers, but I need some cash in order to do that. And so that's the investment story. You first build a business, establish who your customers are, show that the business can be profitable, and then find the investors to give you the cash to back you in growing that and being able to deliver that. So again, revenue is not investment. Revenue is quite separate from investment.